This house is finally ours, my daughter-in-law said over dinner, smiling as she reached for the wine glass like she'd just closed a deal, and I remember blinking at her, not because I didn't hear her, but because I hadn't signed anything, not a single paper, not a single line, and yet the certainty in her voice sat there between us like it belonged, like it had always been true. My son Daniel didn't correct her, didn't even look at me, just kept his eyes on his plate, cutting his steak into careful, even pieces as if precision could replace honesty. And I felt something shift in the room, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet adjustment, like a picture frame slightly tilted on the wall that no one else seemed to notice. I set my fork down, slowly, the way you do when you're buying yourself time, and I asked, "What do you mean, ours?" keeping my voice level calm. The same tone I'd used for decades to keep peace at this very table, but Ashley just laughed softly, a light, practiced sound, and waved her hand as if I were being overly formal. "Oh, you know, Margaret, everything's been taken care of. You don't have to worry about a thing anymore." And there it was, that word, taken care of, the kind people use when they've already made decisions for you. I nodded once, because nodding is easy, nodding keeps things moving. And I've learned that sometimes silence gives you more information than questions ever could. So I let the moment pass, let the conversation drift to safer topics, vacations, renovations, plans that seemed to include my house, but not me. And all the while I watched, the way Ashley leaned forward just a little too confidently, the way Daniel avoided my eyes just a little too carefully, and I realized that whatever had been done, it hadn't happened today. This was something that had been building quietly, piece by piece, behind polite smiles and casual reassurances. Later that night, after they'd gone upstairs, I stood alone in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator louder than it should have been, and I rested my hand against the counter, feeling the familiar grain of the wood my husband had insisted on years ago, saying it would last longer than we would. And I thought about that, about how he'd always been the kind of man who planned ahead, who read every line twice, who trusted slowly and protected quietly, and I wondered what he would have said if he'd heard that sentence at dinner. This house is finally ours, because he had never been careless with what we built, not with money, not with property, and certainly not with me. I moved through the house slowly, turning off lights, each room carrying its own memory, each corner, reminding me that nothing about this place had ever been accidental. And when I reached the study, I paused, my hand hovering over the drawer where we kept important documents, not because I was afraid to open it, but because I already knew that whatever I was about to find would confirm what I'd started to understand at that table, that somewhere between grief and trust, something had been rearranged without me noticing. I opened the drawer and saw the folders exactly where they should be. Neat, organized, untouched at first glance. And yet something felt off, the way a room feels different when someone else has been in it, even if they've put everything back where it belongs. And I took a breath, steady and measured, because panic has never solved anything, and I have never been the kind of woman who reacts before she understands. So I closed the drawer again, gently, almost carefully, and let a small, quiet thought settle in my mind, one that didn't need to be spoken out loud. To be real, if they believed this house was already theirs, then somewhere, somehow, they thought they had proof, and if there was proof, then there was also a trail, and I have lived in this house long enough to know that nothing truly stays hidden forever, not if you know where to look, and I do. I did not open the drawer again that night because I have learned over the years that timing matters more than urgency, and whatever had been set in motion did not happen in a single evening, so it would not unravel in one either, and instead I went to bed, lying on my side of the mattress that still felt too large since my husband passed, staring at the ceiling where the faint outline of a crack ran from one corner to the other, something we had noticed years ago and never bothered to fix because it did not threaten the structure. And I wondered if that was how this began, small things left unattended, small assumptions made out of trust, until suddenly they were no longer small at all. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, before the sun had fully come up, and the house was quiet in that particular way it only is when no one else is awake, and I moved through it slowly, making coffee. The same way I always did, measuring it carefully, pouring the water steadily, because routine has a way of grounding you when everything else starts to feel uncertain. And as I stood there waiting for the machine to finish, I thought about the past few months, about the subtle changes I had dismissed at the time, The way certain letters stopped arriving in the usual stack by the front door, the way Daniel had offered to help with my banking, saying it would be easier for everyone if things were centralized, the way Ashley had started organizing documents for me, always with a reassuring smile, always saying she just wanted to make things simpler. And at the time I had been grateful, because grief makes you tired. It makes even simple decisions feel heavy, and I had allowed myself to lean on them, believing that was what family was supposed to be. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat in the same armchair I had used for years, the one by the window that looked out onto the front yard, and I watched the early light stretch across the grass, thinking about how many mornings I had spent here without noticing anything was wrong. And that was the part that stayed with me. Not that something had been done, but that it had been done so quietly that I had not seen it happening. Later, when Daniel came downstairs, he greeted me with a quick smile that did not quite reach his eyes, asking if I had slept well. And I answered the same way I always did, calmly, without giving anything away, because there is a kind of power in being underestimated. And if they believed I was unaware, then I had no reason to correct them, and Ashley followed shortly after, already dressed, already composed, moving through the kitchen with the ease of someone who felt entirely at home, opening cabinets, rearranging items, making small adjustments that might have seemed helpful to anyone else, but felt different now that I was paying attention. I noticed how she checked her phone more often than necessary, how she glanced at Daniel before speaking, as if confirming something silently. And I began to understand that whatever plan they believed was complete, they were still managing it, still maintaining it. And that meant there would be traces, small ones perhaps, but enough if you knew how to look. When they left the house later that morning, telling me they had errands to run, I watched from the window as their car pulled out of the driveway, and I waited until it disappeared completely before I stood up, setting my empty coffee cup on the table with deliberate care, because I was not rushing. I was not reacting. I was simply moving forward, step by step, the way my husband always did when something required attention. And I walked back to the study, opened the drawer again, and this time I took out each folder one by one, placing them neatly on the desk, not searching frantically but methodically, reading labels, checking dates, noticing details, and it did not take long before I found the first thing that did not belong, a document tucked slightly out of alignment with the others, just enough to catch the eye of someone who knew exactly how it should look, and I picked it up, holding it carefully, already aware that whatever I was about to read would not surprise me as much as it would confirm what I had already begun to see, that somewhere along the way, trust had been replaced with something else entirely, and now it was simply a matter of understanding how far it had gone. I held the document in my hands for a long moment before reading it because there is a difference between suspecting something and seeing it in writing, and once you cross that line, there is no returning to not knowing, and I have lived long enough to understand that clarity, once gained, comes with a certain kind of responsibility. The paper itself looked ordinary. At first glance, standard formatting, clean margins, the kind of document you would expect to see in any legal file. But it was the placement that gave it away, slightly misaligned, just enough to suggest it had been handled recently and returned without the same care as the rest, and that alone told me this was not something left behind by accident. It was something accessed, something used. I began to read slowly, not rushing, letting each line settle before moving to the next, and it did not take long before I saw the words that mattered, references to property transfer, adjustments to ownership structure, language that sounded official but carried a tone I did not recognize as mine. And then I saw it, my name, written in a signature that resembled my own but lacked the small, consistent details that come from years of signing the same way, the slight curve in the final letter, the spacing between first and last name, the pressure points that no one notices except the person who makes them, and I knew immediately that I had never signed this document. I did not react outwardly. There was no sharp intake of breath, no sudden movement, just a quiet stillness as I set the paper down on the desk and rested my hands beside it, because the discovery itself was not the end. It was only the beginning of understanding how this had been done, and more importantly, why they believed it would hold. I continued going through the rest of the folder, finding additional copies, supporting documents, notices that should have reached me but had not, each one forming a clearer picture of a process that had been carefully managed, step by step, with enough attention to detail to appear legitimate on the surface, but not enough to withstand close scrutiny, and that told me something else. This was not the work of someone who understood the full weight of what they were doing. It was the work of someone who believed confidence could replace precision. I thought back to the past few months, to the times Ashley had insisted on helping with paperwork, to the moments Daniel had reassured me that everything was being handled, and I realized now that what I had interpreted as care had been something else entirely, something more controlled, more deliberate, and yet not perfect, because perfection leaves no trace, and this left just enough. I gathered the documents neatly, placing them back into the folder exactly as I had found them, because there was no benefit in revealing that I had seen them, not yet, and I closed the drawer once more, returning the study to its usual order, the same quiet, organized space it had always been, because outward appearances matter when you are dealing with people who rely on assumptions, and I intended to let them keep theirs for as long as it served me. The rest of the afternoon passed in its usual rhythm, small tasks, familiar routines, nothing that would draw attention, and when Daniel and Ashley returned later that day, I greeted them the same way I always had, with a calm expression, a steady voice, asking about their errands as if nothing had changed, and they answered just as easily, unaware that the balance had already shifted, unaware that I was no longer operating on trust but on information, and as I listened to them speak, I noticed something I had not fully appreciated before, the subtle confidence in Ashley's tone, the way she spoke about future plans as if they were already secured, and Daniel's quiet agreement, his willingness to follow her lead without question, and I understood then that they truly believed this was finished, that whatever they had arranged could not be undone, and that belief was not just their mistake, it was their vulnerability. That night, as I sat alone again in the living room, the house quiet around me, I allowed myself a single, measured thought, not emotional, not reactive, just clear and steady. If they had gone this far, if they had created documents, signatures, and a narrative that placed the house in their hands, then somewhere in that process there had to be a safeguard they overlooked, something written, something established long before any of this began. Because my husband was not a man who left things to chance, and if there was one thing I trusted more than anything else, it was that he had already considered the possibility of someone trying to take what we built, and if that was true, then the answer was not in what they had done, but in what he had already prepared, and all I had to do was find it. I did not search for answers immediately because I already knew where they would not be, not in the obvious places, not in the folders that anyone could open and rearrange, and certainly not in anything Ashley would have had access to without question, because my husband had always believed that the most important protections were the ones that did not draw attention to themselves, the kind that sat quietly in the background, unnoticed until they were needed. The next morning, after Daniel and Ashley had left again, I made my way to the hallway closet, the one most people overlooked because it held nothing more than old coats, storage boxes, and a small locked cabinet that had not been opened in years, and I stood there for a moment, looking at it, remembering the last time I had seen him use it, how he had turned the key slowly, almost thoughtfully, before placing something inside and closing it with the same quiet certainty that defined everything he did. I reached into the back of the drawer in the study where I kept miscellaneous items and retrieved the spare key, still attached to the small brass tag he had labeled in his careful handwriting, and as I held it, I felt a sense of steadiness return, not emotional, not sentimental, just a quiet alignment with the way he had always handled things, methodical, deliberate, never rushed. The lock turned without resistance, a soft click that echoed slightly in the stillness of the house, and inside the cabinet were several neatly organized folders, older than the ones in the study, their edges slightly worn but their structure intact, and I took them out one by one, placing them on the floor beside me, not hurrying, not skipping ahead, because this was not about finding something quickly, it was about understanding what had been prepared long before any of this began. I opened the first folder and found records of insurance policies, updated regularly, each page signed and dated with the same consistency I had come to expect. The next held correspondence with financial advisors, notes written in the margins in his familiar handwriting, observations, reminders, questions he had intended to follow up on, and as I moved through them, I began to see the pattern, not just of organization, but of foresight. He had not only managed what we had, he had anticipated what could happen to it. Every possibility considered, every outcome accounted for. When I reached the final folder, I paused, not because I was uncertain, but because I recognized it immediately. The heavier paper, the more formal binding, the kind used for documents that carry weight beyond their pages, and I opened it carefully, reading the title first, confirming what I already suspected. It was the original property agreement, the one we had signed together years ago when we first purchased the house. But there was something different about this copy, an addendum attached at the back, something I did not recall discussing in detail, and I began to read, slowly, line by line, letting the language settle into place. It outlined conditions under which ownership could be challenged, specific scenarios where any transfer made under coercion, misrepresentation, or unauthorized execution would be considered void, not just questionable, but automatically reversed. And as I continued, I felt that same quiet stillness return, the kind that comes not from surprise, but from recognition. Because this was exactly the kind of safeguard he would have put in place, not to control, not to restrict, but to protect against the very thing that had now unfolded. I closed the folder gently, keeping my hand on it for a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but out of acknowledgement, because whatever they believed they had secured, whatever confidence they carried into that dinner conversation, it had been built on something incomplete, something that did not account for this. And I stood up, placing the folders back into the cabinet in the same order I had found them, locking it again with the same quiet motion, because nothing about this required urgency, not anymore. The truth was already in place, already written, already waiting, and as I walked back through the house, I understood that this was no longer about discovering what had been done. It was about deciding when to let them realize what they had missed. I did not feel the need to confront them, not yet, because confrontation is only effective when the other side believes they still have control, and Daniel and Ashley still believed exactly that. So I let the days unfold as they normally would, keeping my routines intact, making breakfast in the same quiet way, asking the same simple questions, listening more than I spoke, and in that silence I began to notice things I had missed before, not because they were hidden, but because I had not been looking closely enough. Ashley started talking more openly about changes she wanted to make to the house, mentioning renovations, furniture, even discussing which rooms could be repurposed, and she spoke about it with a kind of casual authority, as if the decisions had already been finalized somewhere beyond my reach, while Daniel nodded along, offering small confirmations, adding details that made it sound like they had been planning this for weeks, if not months, and I realized that their confidence was not just based on the documents I had found. It was based on repetition, on saying something often enough that it begins to feel true. One afternoon, while we were sitting in the living room, Ashley brought up the idea of updating the master bedroom, suggesting that it would make more sense for them to move into it, given the layout of the house, and she said it lightly, almost as if she were offering a practical solution rather than making a decision, and I looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not with surprise, just with a quiet understanding of what she was revealing. And I nodded slowly, saying, "That sounds like something to think about, because agreement, even partial, can reveal more than resistance ever will." Later that evening, I overheard them talking in the kitchen, their voices low but not low enough, and Ashley was explaining something about timelines, about how once everything was fully processed, there would be nothing left to question, and Daniel asked if they needed to do anything else, and she assured him that everything had already been handled, that all that was left was to move forward. And I stood there for a moment, just out of sight, listening, not because I needed confirmation, but because hearing it from them, in their own words, gave me a clearer sense of how far they believed they had gone. I returned to the living room quietly, sitting down in my usual chair, folding my hands in my lap, and letting the conversation fade behind me, because by then I understood something important. They were not waiting for approval. They were waiting for inevitability. They believed that whatever had been set in motion could no longer be stopped, and that belief had made them careless, not in the documents themselves, but in the way they carried it, in the way they spoke, in the way they assumed I would simply accept it. Over the next few days, I continued to let them move forward with their plans, watching as Ashley measured spaces, made calls, discussed contractors, each step reinforcing her certainty, and Daniel followed her lead, contributing where he could, but never questioning the foundation of what they were building. And I realized that this was the moment my husband had prepared for, not the moment of discovery, but the moment of overconfidence, when those who believe they have secured everything begin to reveal the extent of their assumptions. I kept my own actions simple, organized, precise, gathering copies of the documents I had found, reviewing them carefully, noting the inconsistencies, the signatures that did not align, the dates that did not match the sequence of events I remembered, and I placed them in a folder of my own, separate from the others, not hidden, but not visible either, because this was not about secrecy. It was about readiness. One evening, as we sat down to dinner again, the same table, the same quiet arrangement of plates and glasses, Ashley smiled in that same confident way and began talking about the future of the house as if it were already theirs, and I listened without interruption, allowing her to finish, allowing Daniel to add his agreement. And when the conversation paused, I simply said, "That sounds like a lot of planning." And she nodded, satisfied, unaware that what she was describing was not a future I needed to accept, but a narrative I was allowing her to complete, because the more complete it became, the clearer it would be when it unraveled. And as I looked at them across the table, I felt no urgency, no need to correct them, because everything I needed was already in place, not in their version of events, but in the one they had never fully read. I chose the morning carefully because timing is not just about convenience. It is about control, and I wanted everything to unfold in a place where assumptions could not hide behind familiarity. So after breakfast, while Daniel was still finishing his coffee and Ashley was checking her phone, I said calmly, "I need both of you to come with me this afternoon. There are a few things about the house I would like to review." And I kept my tone neutral, not urgent, not emotional, just direct enough to make it sound routine. And Ashley looked up immediately, her expression shifting for a brief second before settling back into that same composed confidence, asking, "Is something wrong?" And I shook my head slightly. "No, I just think it is time everything is clear." And that word, clear, seemed to settle something in her, because she nodded and agreed without hesitation, while Daniel simply followed along, as he always had. And I knew then that they still believed this was a formality, a final step in something they had already secured. The drive to the office was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when each person believes they understand what is about to happen, but only one of them actually does, and I watched the road ahead, steady, familiar, while Ashley occasionally spoke about future plans, renovations, timelines, speaking as if the outcome was already decided. And Daniel responded with small affirmations, his voice measured but distant, and I realized that he was not questioning her, not questioning anything, because he had already accepted the version of events she had given him. When we arrived, I led them inside, greeting the receptionist with the same polite nod I had used for years, and she recognized me immediately, offering a warm smile before guiding us toward the office at the end of the hallway. And as we walked, I noticed Ashley's posture, upright, confident, her steps steady, as if she were walking into a meeting she expected to win, and Daniel stayed just slightly behind her, not leading, not resisting, simply present. Inside the office, Mr. Bennett stood up from behind his desk, older now but still carrying the same quiet authority I remembered, and he greeted me first, then Daniel, then Ashley, his eyes observant but unreadable, and we all took our seats, the arrangement simple, deliberate, nothing about it dramatic, just 3 chairs across from a desk that had seen more than its share of conversations like this. Ashley was the first to speak, her voice smooth, controlled, explaining that there had already been arrangements made regarding the house, that everything had been handled properly, that they simply wanted to ensure all documentation was aligned, and she spoke as if she were clarifying something minor, something administrative, and I let her finish without interruption, because sometimes the most important thing is letting someone fully commit to what they believe. When she was done, I placed my folder on the desk, opening it carefully, not rushing, sliding the documents forward one by one, the copies I had gathered, the inconsistencies I had noted, the signatures that did not align. And I said only, "I would like these reviewed." And Mr. Bennett nodded, taking his time as he looked through each page, his expression unchanged, his movements precise. And the room grew quieter with each passing second, not tense, not yet, just still, as if everything was waiting for a single point of confirmation. Ashley shifted slightly in her seat, her confidence still present, but now accompanied by a trace of impatience, as if she expected this to be resolved quickly in her favor. And Daniel glanced between us, uncertain for the first time, and I remained still, my hands folded in my lap, because this was no longer about what I had found. It was about what had already been written long before any of this began. And as Mr. Bennet reached the final page, pausing just long enough to read it again, I knew that the moment they had been building toward was not the one they imagined, but the one they had overlooked entirely. Mr. Bennet did not speak immediately after finishing the last page, and that silence carried more weight than anything Ashley had said up to that point, because it was the kind of pause that comes from certainty, not confusion, and he placed the document down carefully, aligning it with the others before folding his hands on the desk, his expression calm, but no longer neutral. And when he finally looked up, he did not address Ashley first. He looked at me, just briefly, a quiet acknowledgement, before turning his attention to both of them and saying in a steady, measured voice, "I am going to explain this clearly so there is no misunderstanding." And the shift in tone was subtle but unmistakable, the kind that signals the conversation has moved from assumption to fact. Ashley leaned forward slightly, still composed, still holding on to that confidence she had carried into the room, and Daniel sat back, his posture tightening just enough to show that something had begun to unsettle him. And Mr. Bennet continued, "The documents you have presented suggest a transfer of ownership. However, they contain multiple inconsistencies, including a signature that does not match Mrs. Collins' verified records." And Ashley opened her mouth as if to respond, but he raised his hand slightly, not abruptly, just enough to hold the moment, and continued, "More importantly, there is an addendum attached to the original property agreement that governs any such transfer." And he reached for another folder, the one I had already seen, and placed it on the desk, opening it with the same deliberate care. The room felt different then, not louder, not tense in the usual way, but grounded, as if something solid had finally been placed beneath what had previously been built on assumption. And Ashley's expression shifted again, not dramatically, just a slight narrowing of her eyes, a recalculation, while Daniel's gaze moved from the documents to me and back again, searching for something he could not yet name. Mr. Bennet turned the pages, slowly, stopping at the section that mattered, and he read aloud, his voice steady, precise. "Any transfer of ownership executed under conditions of misrepresentation, unauthorized signature, or coercion shall be deemed null and void, and full ownership shall revert immediately to the original party without requirement of additional action." And he let the words settle, not repeating them, not emphasizing them further, because they did not require it. Ashley sat back slightly, her hands now resting more rigidly on the arm of her chair, and for the first time since we had entered the room, she did not speak immediately, and Daniel's expression changed in a way that was quieter but more revealing. The certainty he had carried replaced by something closer to realization, and I watched them both, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just with the same calm attention I had held from the beginning. Because this was not a moment of victory, it was simply the moment where understanding replaced belief. Ashley finally spoke, her voice controlled but sharper now, asking, "Are you saying the transfer is invalid?" And Mr. Bennet nodded once. "I am saying that based on the documentation and the governing agreement, there is no legal basis for the transfer to stand." And the clarity of that statement left no room for interpretation, no space to negotiate or reframe. And the room fell into that same quiet again, but this time it was different, heavier, more defined, because it no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to consequence. Daniel looked at Ashley then, not accusing, not yet, but searching, as if trying to reconcile what he had been told with what he was now hearing, and she held his gaze for a moment before looking back at the documents, her confidence not entirely gone but no longer unchallenged. And I remained where I was, my hands still folded, my posture unchanged, because nothing about this required movement from me. Everything that needed to be said had already been written, long before this conversation ever began. And as I sat there, listening to the quiet settle fully into the room, I understood that the version of events they had believed in so completely had just come to an end, Not through argument, not through confrontation, but through the simple presence of something they had never taken the time to fully read. No one spoke immediately after that because there are moments when silence is not emptiness but recognition, and this was one of them. The kind where everything that needed to be understood had already been placed on the table, leaving nothing but the weight of it to settle. Ashley was the first to move, not dramatically, just a slight shift in her posture, her shoulders tightening as she reached for the edge of the desk, her fingers resting there as if grounding herself, and when she spoke. Again, her voice was still controlled but no longer smooth. There must be some mistake. The documents were processed properly. And Mr. Bennett did not respond with argument. He simply turned one of the pages back toward her, tapping lightly on the signature line. This signature does not match verified records, and even if it did, the addendum overrides any transfer executed under these conditions. And the clarity of his tone left no room for reinterpretation, no space to negotiate what had already been defined. Daniel leaned forward then, his attention fixed on the document as if seeing it for the first time, his brow slightly furrowed, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not anger, not yet, but the beginning of doubt, the kind that starts quietly and grows with every unanswered question. And he looked at Ashley, not accusing, but searching. "You said everything was handled." And she met his gaze, holding it for a moment before looking back at the papers, her composure still present but strained now, thinner than before. I remained where I was, my hands still folded, because there was nothing for me to add, nothing that required my voice. This was not a conversation I needed to lead. It was one that had already reached its conclusion without me needing to push it forward. Mr. Bennett closed the folder gently, aligning the papers once more before speaking again. At this point, there is no legal transfer of ownership, and any actions taken based on that assumption would not be recognized, and he paused briefly, allowing that to settle before continuing. If there are further questions, they can be addressed through proper legal channels, but the status of the property is not in question. And that was the moment the room changed completely, not in volume, not in movement, but in certainty, because what had been assumed as inevitable had now been defined as invalid. Ashley sat back fully in her chair, her hands now resting in her lap, no longer reaching, no longer guiding the conversation, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not have an immediate response, and Daniel's attention shifted slowly from the documents to me. And there was something different in his expression now, something quieter, more uncertain, as if he were trying to understand not just what had happened, but how he had allowed himself to believe it in the first place. I met his gaze briefly, not with accusation, not with explanation, just with a calm acknowledgement, because this was not about correcting him. It was about allowing him to see clearly, and clarity does not require force, it only requires space. Ashley finally stood, her movement controlled but deliberate, and she said, "We should go." Not looking at me this time, not looking at Mr. Bennett, just directing the words into the room as if that alone could restore some sense of control, and Daniel followed, rising more slowly, his eyes still moving between us, between the documents, between the version of reality he had accepted and the one now placed in front of him. I stood as well, not in response to them, but because the conversation had reached its natural end, and I thanked Mr. Bennett quietly, gathering my folder with the same care I had used when placing it down, and as we walked out of the office, the hallway felt longer than before, not because it had changed, but because the certainty that had filled it when we arrived was no longer there, replaced instead by something quieter, something unresolved. Outside, the air felt different, clearer in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, and as we reached the car, Ashley moved ahead, unlocking the door without speaking, and Daniel paused for a moment beside me, as if he wanted to say something, but the words did not come, and I did not offer any either, because whatever needed to be understood had already been said, not by me, not by them, but by something far more consistent than either of us, something that had been written long before this moment and had now, finally, been read. The drive back home was quieter than before, not the comfortable kind of quiet that comes from familiarity, but the kind that settles when something has been removed and nothing has taken its place yet, and I sat in the passenger seat watching the road pass by, the same streets I had known for years, Yet they felt slightly different now, not because they had changed, but because the assumptions that once shaped them had shifted, and Ashley kept her eyes forward, her hands steady on the wheel, saying nothing, no explanations, no attempts to fill the silence. And Daniel sat in the back, just behind me. His presence there felt distant in a way it never had before, as if he were no longer sure where he stood in relation to either of us. When we pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had, unchanged, steady, indifferent to everything that had just happened, and for a moment none of us moved. The engine idling softly before Ashley turned it off, and she stepped out, first without a word, walking toward the front door with the same controlled pace she had carried all day, while Daniel followed more slowly, and I remained seated for a moment longer, allowing myself that brief pause, not out of hesitation, but out of acknowledgement, because there is a difference between returning to a place and returning to what it represents. When I finally stepped inside, the air felt familiar again, grounded, and I moved through the house as I always did, setting my keys down in their usual place, placing my folder carefully on the table, and I could feel their attention on me, waiting, perhaps expecting something more, a reaction, a confrontation, an explanation, but I had none to give, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already been established, not by emotion, but by fact. Ashley stood near the kitchen, her posture still composed but no longer certain, and Daniel lingered by the doorway, his eyes moving between us, searching for something that had already been resolved, and I turned to face them both, not sharply, not dramatically, just with the same calm presence I had carried from the beginning, and I said, "This house has not changed." And I let the words settle, not as a statement of ownership, but as a statement of reality, and neither of them responded immediately, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to reinterpret. Ashley finally spoke, her voice quieter now, measured in a way that suggested she was choosing each word carefully. We thought everything was already finalized, and I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of what they had believed, and I replied, "You believed what you wanted to believe." And there was no accusation in my tone, no anger, just clarity, the kind that does not require emphasis. Daniel stepped forward then, his voice uncertain, asking, "What happens now?" And I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, not as the boy he once was, not as the man he had tried to become, but as someone standing between two versions of truth, and I answered simply, "Now, things return to what they have always been." And I turned away, not dismissively, not abruptly, just naturally, as if the conversation had reached its end, because for me it had. The rest of the evening unfolded quietly, each of us moving through the house in our own way, the same rooms, the same spaces, but with a different understanding of what they meant, and I noticed the small changes immediately, the way Ashley no longer spoke about renovations, the way Daniel moved more carefully, as if aware of something he had not fully considered before, and I continued with my routine, preparing dinner, setting the table, not out of habit alone, but because consistency has a way of restoring balance when everything else shifts. Later that night, as I sat alone in the living room once more, the house quiet around me, I allowed myself a single, steady thought, not of victory, not of loss, but of clarity, because in the end, nothing had been taken from me, nothing had been lost. What had changed was not the house, not the ownership, but the understanding of the people within it. And as I looked around at the walls, the furniture, the small details that had been built over years, I realized that this place had never belonged to assumption. It had always belonged to what was real. And reality does not need to be defended, it only needs to be seen.